Hello and welcome back. In my last video, I did a story time, and I hope to do more of those. I hope those of you who watched it found it helpful, found it interesting. This video is a return back to the videos that I have been doing in the past, so much more clinically related. And for those of you who enjoyed some of those previous videos, this may be for you. Also, from what I recall in my last video, which was looking around the area of CBT, and I covered a few different topics, I'd mentioned that we would touch the topic at some point of diagnosis. So, in today's video, I'll touch on that in a general way, but I want to broaden the conversation very much into the area of why diagnosis is really important, why appropriate diagnosis is so important, and in line with the heading of this video, diagnosis and clinical conceptualization or formulation, whichever way you like to say it, for those of you in the area, why that becomes so important, and how good identification, good use of strategic therapeutic tools bring our clients the best outcomes. So this is important ethically, best practice perspective, and all of those things. But before we begin, this video became more motivated recently because I'm just having come off the back of lecturing final year students on advanced CBT. So in the college where I lecture, there we lecture psychotherapy, and if I do so say so myself, the college lecture at probably the best standard you're going to find. Maybe another video in time as to why that is, but there's a number of reasons. One of the main ones is the people who lecture are in practice. Therefore, it's not just an academic piece people get. They get great they get great input from well experienced people. Some much more experienced than I. But again, the people who provide the education are people who have a very ingrained background in the area and have been very much involved in it from the very early days, since before I was around. Okay? So it's got in the sense of the lecture, so it's got there's quite a background. But coming off that weekend of lecturing students in advanced CBT, I said in the college I'm in, we allow students to pick, they must pick one of three electives that are advanced. So advanced CBT is one. The other modality would be advanced psychodynamic, and then the other modality again, advanced humanistic. And for those of you in the field, you'll be aware that they fundamentally, when you boil it down, in the field of psychotherapy, they will be the three orthodox modalities that lots of therapists would work from. Okay. We often sometimes hear the phrase an integrative therapist. Well, an integrative therapist is a therapist using what they perceive to be at times the best from each of those based on their level of experience with them. So, having come off that weekend, I very much had clinical skills in my mind. And then I'd remember that I said I'd do a video, something around this area. So here we go. So you're really, really welcome. I say this could be relevant when I think about this. This could be relevant if you're a student or if you're just interested in going into the area, or indeed if you're already in the area. And maybe it's always helpful to revisit primary principles. If you're working with any person therapeutically, there's core things to be mindful of. And I will touch on them again in a broad, not speaking specifically, but generally broadly within the capacity here. Okay. So first thing is to get onto my soapbox and then get off my soapbox. So I have a soapbox. As people may know this, I have a bit of a passion around accurate language. And when you see all around you things that aren't that accurate, and this whole area of mental health can have aspects whereby things get diluted, it makes me even more passionate to go back to getting it right from the get-go. Now, obviously, an amount of this comes from my opinion, but it's an informed opinion. And many colleagues and many people I work with who are in this area and who are established in the area would also have the same view, a similar view. So the first thing is, I have an issue with the word mental health, fundamentally. And there's an important reason for that, and that we have for years in Ireland and across the world, I suppose, tried to deal appropriately with stigma. In my opinion, the word mental health will always keep a stigma there. So the first thing that I think is important is to let's call things like depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and the gamut of different things people can find themselves vulnerable and experiencing and suffering from. Let's call them what they are. Let's be empirically accurate. Let's be factually accurate. They're health conditions. Okay? As far back as the DSM-4, from recollection, if memory serves me right, yes, there was a the authors said in the kind of preamble part of it that in addressing mental health presentations, I'm not quoting here, but I'm giving you the kind of the headline paraphrase. There is lots of physical in the mental and mental in the physical. So when we take any issue, like depression, any of these things, they can be as much in the body as mind. So we have to address both. We have to be aware of that. And therefore, the more appropriate term, and actually the more accurate term, my opinion aside, is that they're health conditions. Now, obviously, in the video here, I may slip back and say the mental health, but just remember that's in the background. We use mental health because it's a grand word to use in the vernacular. But for the sake of being absolutely explicit and clear, health is a more appropriate term. The second thing that really frustrates me, and students who have me know it, because very quickly I try to help them think in a different way about this. And this is not helped. And it is, I'll tell you what it is first. It's causes of anxiety, causes of depression. And here's the thing, textbooks, not so much, but some do. And books often have chapters saying the causes of the problem. What causes the anxiety? What causes the depression? What causes the intrusive thoughts? As if there's variables that are so discrete we can identify and name them as cause. And whether we might like to believe this or not, we're still learning an awful lot about quote unquote causes. Causes is an inaccurate term. It's much more accurate because this is more true, that we know what are risk factors to things. So in many presentations, we know adverse childhood experiences, traumas, situations as we go through life, they all affect us in different ways. And if you like to think about these issues or diagnoses as a kind of a C, if we thought of diagnosis as a C, any diagnosis you have or a client of yours has or whatever that would be, if you imagine, well, lots of rivers and lakes maybe flowed into that. In other words, lots of causes from different angles often explain why the syndrome of a mental health, there we go, or health presentations such as social anxiety disorders, phobias, or any of these things, it's often the culmination of a number of different things. We use the word diathesis, which is a word really referring to all the things, the variables in your life from the time of inception all the way through as you develop, the sorts of different variables that can make you more vulnerable to the presentations that we often see. Okay? So just those 2 points. Forgive me if they seem a bit maybe confronting in that, but I think it's important that we are, maybe I'm old-fashioned. Old-fashioned, I believe words actually have meanings and that we need to be clear with language and we're not serving ourselves when we dilute these sorts of things out. So it's important. It also is it validates clients much better. It helps to, foster an inclusion of their own lived experiences and maybe get away from what some psychologists and people who experience psychologists, psychotherapists can often find it as a judgmental experience or something like that, when in actual fact, we have, in fact, and in the empirical data, a much broader way, and I would believe now as we're going through things, a healthier way of looking at health issues. So, just that's out of the way. We just park that for now. Okay. So let's start looking, I suppose, at the kind of the main body of this and what I wanted to bring to you today. So, as I said, I came off the back of lecturing this module, and one of the emphases that I was putting over with students who are training in this area is that after they've done all of this, they have a training behind them. They are now going out, and it's quite an emotional thing to see a group of people just go out there, and now they're going out there to work clinically with people. So they have the academics, they have the theory, but they don't necessarily have the competence. They have an element of competence, but competence, there is no replacement for experience and time working with clients. And it grows from there and it builds. And that's a really important thing. So I felt that my job was very much to equip them as best I could in their last module so that they would be aware of some of the very fundamental things to be doing in assessment and work in CBT, um, and that they would have an idea of some of the new areas that CBT is now getting into, like third and fourth wave approaches, which have been around for a while. But anyway, maybe that's the topic of it. I think that's a topic for another video. But let's stay with this. So the first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss this from the perspective of things that those who start using CBT, and this is not an advisory video, okay? To mention that, just things that you need to be aware of. And if you've done training in CBT, none of this will be new to you. But I will emphasize the following 5 things. So, here's what you might want to do here. I'm going to discuss the 5 Ps of case formulation or case conceptualization, which really speaks to the purpose of the video here. And if you want, maybe open up a tab on your computer, and if you want to just listen to me instead of looking at me, and have a look as we talk through these, okay? Because these are some of the CBT 101 aspects of understanding an individual who comes and who needs help, okay? So students always wonder, well, where do I begin? Well, you begin with good assessment, okay? And this comes from having different abilities. I suppose it comes from having different trainings, but ultimately, if you know aspects of the following 5 things I'm going to talk about, it gives you a very strong foundation for work you bring to supervision around a particular client you're working with, but also your own overall awareness of things you might know and things you may not, and therefore need to identify. So the 5 Ps are as follows. I'll call them out, and then I'm going to discuss each one in turn, some in more detail than others, but just to give you an idea. So the 5 Ps of case formulation. The first one is the presenting issue. Can we say with confidence what the client is coming into the room with? That's the first P. The next P is what are the predisposing factors? What made that client vulnerable in the first place? What's the rich history of their lives that led them to you? Okay? Like that example of all the rivers going into the sea. Was there harm? Was there abuse? Was there, what were the things that led them vulnerable? Chronic illness. Third thing, funny, just as I say I'm going to talk about the 3, then I go into, don't worry, we'll get to it. I'll arrest my tendency. The next one is the precipitating factors. What are the precipitating factors? This in the vernacular would be called a word I really feel is unhelpful, but it does get used, so I'll use it for the sake of explaining what we mean by precipitating. A precipitating factor is a trigger. What triggers the person to find themselves overwhelmed? What are those sort of things? The next P is the perpetuating factors. We'll talk about what they are. And these can be things that we have to be sensitive about raising in our client work. But we'll talk a little bit about them. But effectively, what they are the factors that keep a problem going, such as avoidance and anxiety, stuff like that. We'll get to that. And then the 5th P is the protective factors. We need to honor in people and learn from people because they know themselves best. What is it that helps them? What have they tried in the past that helps them? What do they lean into for support? Who do they have support? Do they have support? So there's lots of things we need to know. We as people who provide as practitioners who provide whatever work we are providing in service and support in CBT, we've got to know these things before we make any assumptions. In fact, it's so important here to arrest your judgment or understanding as to what's happening with someone until you've gotten a lot of information in these domains. So let's go to the first P. So the presenting issue. Okay. Know this now. Comorbidity is the rule, not the exception. So what we mean by that, when we say comorbidity, it's more than one presentation that someone might have. And one of the things we know is that it is rare enough that someone comes in needing help for just one thing, right? Or there's one presentation playing out. Very, very often, someone comes in and there's a complex range of issues. So the first P of presenting, what is presenting? Oftentimes, sometimes that's clear, sometimes it's not. And what can help that is appropriate diagnosis. And the reason diagnosis is so important, there's a few reasons. But let's just start by talking about what we mean. So when we talk about things like social anxiety disorder or specific disorders, these are effectively syndromes. And again, another video, I might actually go into a lot of detail in terms of how they can be diagnosed. But for the sake of it, they are syndromes. They are identified patterns that a person finds themselves experiencing. And there's different tools that can help diagnose those. In some cases, diagnosis cannot be made unless you have a psychiatrist or medical professional, which is very appropriate, particularly in the more complicated presentations. Um, and there's many different tools. There's many different tools we can use: psychometric assessments, clinical interviews. But this is why your interview and you're listening to your client and also screening, good discrimination. And what I mean by that is good identifying, does the person, is it this, or this, is really important because it may be this, and this. But if it's this, and this, then the question is, where do we begin? Which one is most important to commence with? So if we can use and be very mindful and cognizant of, does our client already have a diagnosis? In my own clinical work, I always work off diagnosis, but that's not everybody. Where I would have psychiatrists send on someone with notes and we'd have information. And then I would have my own assessments like a Y box for OCD, a Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale. I might have a DAS, Depression, Anxiety, Stress Scale, usually using a number of these things to try to refine down what are we really dealing with. And of course, what does our client feel is most important for them? So getting on top of what's presenting is very important. Okay. And again, as I said just in the beginning of that part, comorbidity tends to be the rule. And even when it's not the rule, someone comes in and brings up something. In my experience, I hate the term, this my lived experience, but in my lived experience clinically, it can be the smokescreen for something else. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way. It can be a thing that presents in, but there's something else under it. And that can be the case too. So again, getting a handle on what's the main presenting issue. So it seems straightforward, doesn't it? But that's where I would take 90 minutes with somebody to try to work that out sometimes as part of an assessment. So if you were going for CBT as an intervention, you'd want to know that the person working with you is going to spend a little bit of time to identify what seems to be the presentation. And that's really, really important. Okay. So that part is just one that people should spend a little bit of time on. Okay. What's the presenting issue? So we've said that, right? And as we go through this, I might come back to that aspect as well. But it is really important. You would want to know, as I said, that someone is really looking at that. And sometimes clients themselves aren't particularly sure, and that's okay too. But they need to be held and understood and to be supported in identifying what those things are. Another reason diagnosis is vital for anyone now wondering, oh, John, is it so important? Well, depending on what someone has, CBT has formulations and models to use with them. So for that reason, it's also very important. If someone presents to me with anxiety, and then someone presents with me in the afternoon with depression, the approach I'm using with the anxious client and the approach I will use with the depressed client are qualitatively different. If I got a depressed client to go and journal for the next week, they'd probably come back worse. If I got an anxious client to do it, maybe not. Point being, CBT outlines, and for those of you who are CBT purists now, forgive this term, well, I kind of am, but there tend to be protocols for different presentations, broadly. Okay, there's always need for fluidity and moving. But generally speaking, there are stages we need for best practice interventions we need to work with. Okay. So if I had someone, and I'll give you if I had someone, here's an example, who comes and they have anxiety. Well, that's all interesting, but what type? Now, if I find out that it's a generalized anxiety presentation, the most pretty much the most difficult anxiety presentation to work with, then I will need to be aware of what model might address that in my work with the client. So in that case, for example, generalized anxiety disorder, what jumps out to my mind is the intolerance of uncertainty model by Dugas. Okay? If someone came in with social anxiety disorder, well, then the chances are I'll probably be using a Wells and Clark 1995 model. I think it was 95. I'll be using that. Why? Because the data tells us, and the evidence and best practice tells us, that this model, based off having a certain presentation, explains for the client and informs the therapy going forward. So forgive me staying on that P for a while, the presenting issue, but it is important, and it's important to get as much from that as possible. Okay. The next P is the predisposing P, predisposing variables. What made our client vulnerable? What made us vulnerable? What were the things that happened? And of course, that's often part of a clinical interview where you're going back in the past to learn of the different things that would have happened for people. They can be very traumatic things or not so traumatic necessarily, but cumulative. Okay? They can be an isolated incident that had a particularly big thing. We now know particularly that talking about trauma isn't that helpful because trauma can happen. There can be a lot of trauma, but what actually matters is just how does the trauma change the person? And ipso facto, when trauma does change people, it changes them in a significant way very often. That's, in other words, it can end up being the PTSD or the CPTSD or whatever it happens to be. So again, just being mindful of the various different things. So that's about learning from a person what happened to you, what happened in life, what were all of those early experiences, what was your family dynamic like, how were the relationships, this can go into all sorts of things, but essentially what we're saying is, okay, what created the diathesis or the vulnerability to you and now experiencing what you're experiencing? Okay. So what were all those predisposing factors? Generally speaking, we know that the risk factors, to go back to what I said earlier, not causes, risk factors tend to be a combination of biological vulnerability, factors in genetics, combined also with experiences, kind of nature and nurture, and how those things come together as a confluence. Okay? Very, very often that's what we're left with. So that's our second P, okay? Predisposing factors. I would want to be really clear when I'm sitting with someone who's coming to me, what brought them here? What was their story? We need to validate that. We need to understand that. What were the things that happened? Did they matter? What do they think? Really important. This can, on occasion, become a become important to bring in a member of the family. In other words, a kind of a collateral history, someone who knows the person very well based on the person's consent for that, just to learn more and more about the richness of their growing up and their experience. Um, so, and this speaks to something I suppose that we often psychotherapists love to talk about, like self-development and personal development, which is really important, really important. But a lot of people sometimes fall into the trap of believing that's about you reflecting on you. Like you need to do the work on you to know yourself. Well, yeah, you do, but that's not enough. The other way to know yourself is how other people know you. So the input of a third party is always very helpful. Okay? That's the second P. Third P are the precipitating factors. And what I might do actually, what I will do, is when I've gone through all these P's, I will give you an example and speak to each of these with it to maybe make it more real instead of it being a bit abstract. Okay. So the precipitating things are, again, that word. What the word I use rather than trigger is maybe the antecedents or the activating events or the thing that happened at the time you started to feel overwhelmed. In other words, we're talking about, and okay, I'll use it here. We're talking about the trigger. Okay. Some people are aware of what activates them and triggers them. Others are not. Uh, you'll often hear people say, "Oh God, I was in Little and it came out of nowhere." Of course, it didn't come out of nowhere, but that's how it feels. And that's very real for a person. It came from nowhere. All of a sudden, I was just breathing heavy, and I felt a sense of doom around me, very real things people can have in the sort of thing like a panic disorder or whatever might be manifesting for them. Um, a trigger could be for someone with social anxiety getting an invitation to a night out. Say, oh God, John, as soon as I saw that on WhatsApp, I was like, God, what am I going to do? Or it could be an upcoming thing they have to do in work, a presentation they have to make. So there can again be things that trigger. Okay? And knowing them is important for a number of reasons. Knowing them is important because it helps you know yourself more. That's the first thing. Another reason it's important is that sometimes it is possible, and before people who are clinically trained here as well jump down my throat and say, oh, you shouldn't do this or recommend this. Sometimes it's important to step away from your triggers. Not a long-term solution, but temporarily people come and sometimes step away, and sometimes that's appropriate. But obviously, where we want to go is where someone is able to sit and not be as activated, or be activated and not have to run away or escape or avoid. This is what you see in anxiety type of presentations. In fact, anxiety nearly every day ending in Y, no matter what the type of anxiety someone has, the behavioral component in anxiety from the cognitive model is avoidance. In depression, it can seem like that, but it's often more withdrawal. People withdraw. So, but anyway, what are the triggers? And just learning that is so important. Fourth one is the perpetuating factors. Now, what's a perpetuating factor? Well, the name perpetuating generally means something that keeps an inertia, keeps something going. So sometimes unbeknownst to ourselves, or sometimes we're very aware of it, we do engage in behavior. We do engage in behavior, and which keeps the problem going, even though we believe it helps us feel better. An example of that is avoiding a scenario you're feeling emotional around, right? And through the avoidance, feeling relief. Now, whilst that might be a good thing in you stepping away and feeling better in the moment, longitudinally as you go forward, that's not helping the anxiety. In fact, it's galvanizing the anxiety and making it stronger. Another example of perpetuating, could be the rampant rumination people do in their heads, cycling over something, continually, compulsively thinking something through. Never works to bring relief. But again, very human, very understandable. Okay. What people trained in CBT need to be good at is appropriately helping clients in the process understand that in a non-shaming way, in a way that they do not feel they are being judged by seeing that there's a pattern they actually do as well that keeps it going, because some clients can't find that. Um, I've worked with clients whereby there'd be underlying personality disorder, particularly borderline type personality, and you know, that's a very hard thing for someone. It's not their fault. It's just the way traumas have affected how they developed at key points in their development. And as a result of that, being dramatic and impulsive is often the behavior they find themselves in. They can also be very sensitive to feeling even in a supportive clinical way. When you're in the clinical context, they can still feel judgment or be at higher risk than another client maybe to feel like they are being judged. So just being aware of that. So what is the client doing that's keeping the problem going? Someone with hypochondriasis or health anxiety, constantly going to the doctor or for scans for reassurance. That's probably a maintenance factor. It's probably keeping it going because it only ever brings short-term relief, only for the pattern to galvanize itself and become worse. Okay? And then finally, we have the protective factors. And these are often overlooked. And this is very frustrating as to why they can be, because it's vitally important. It's vitally important to lean in and understand what our clients do that actually, in reality, keeps them well. I mean, you know, maybe this is an episodic presentation they have, or maybe it's there all the time, but still they function well. So, insofar as what they have, what keeps them well with it? What are the things that they have? Have they supportive family, relationships? a hobby. These things are really important. And we can lose sight of this when we're very clinically focused. And we mustn't lose sight of it because you do that at your peril because you're not learning from your client what works for them. And sometimes, in my experience, you discover that there's something they're doing that isn't working but once did. So why is that now? Yeah. Or there's something that works in part, but sometimes doesn't always. So sometimes it's about refining a strategy a client might be using to help them more. So there's the 5 P's given. Now let's take an example. Okay? And I'll now slot the example. And it'll be a very general example, but let's just take an example so maybe you can make what I'm saying more understandable. Okay. And again, just to mention to those of you who've been for CBT, your practitioner should have shown you this. Okay, so or at least in some way, they mightn't have done a 5 Ps on the board now, like the way I've discussed it. Okay, but you should, from a psychoeducational perspective, which is key to the modality, they would hopefully have helped you see those various different factors that might be at play. Okay. I do it in a very kind of formalized way. Some other people do it maybe in a more evolving, evolutionary way in the room. But either way, you should have that awareness, you know, um, because that informs the rationale behind certain, forgive the term, homework in CBT, or at least some, it should always be aimed towards your goals, and it should always factor in a person's ability, and also ultimately, are we confident we're working with this presentation? Because that infers the sort of tools we do use. Okay, so let's take someone who presents with social anxiety. Now, social anxiety disorder, SAD, as it's sometimes referred to, um, is not fear of people, okay, or fear of meeting new people, or all these things. Okay, again, you get these vernacular explanations which are never enough. Um, if you look at DSM criteria, Diagnostic System Manual for Mental Disorders, it's now currently version 5. But for those of you familiar with it and those of you working it, you will know that it's much more to do with the vulnerability a person feels that they are being judged or appraised by other people. So it's not that they're meeting someone different, it's that in that meeting, that person is thinking certain things about them. They themselves are feeling like they'll do something silly, that they'll reveal themselves something about them, that people will judge them as being deficient, not good enough, or what have I found out? Imagine people really knew the me. All of these things can be at play with people who have social anxiety to different degrees. Okay, but they can all be at play in some way. So it's that fear of negative appraisal of the self from external sources, usually people, obviously, like, that would somehow judge them. Okay. So let's take someone who would have that and fit that into the description of the 5 Ps. So imagine we have a diagnosis of that. Just thought experiment, right? Someone's diagnosed with that. Okay. Then we might learn about what were the predisposing factors. So it could have been sheltered upbringing, challenging relationships at home, or just having maybe a shy disposition. But then that being reinforced by different things, such as, oh, she doesn't do that, he doesn't do that. They do their own thing, whatever it is, maybe reinforced that way. It could have been bullying in school, or it could have been shame, having experience early of shame about something, and therefore retracting and finding people threatening. Okay, whatever number of things, but there could be a number of things there that predispose the person to that. Okay. Um, a slightly higher sense of kind of that people may judge them negatively, and more of a sense of, oh, I'd be responsible for how people see me, and this can be really thing. This can be a really big thing for people. So they could be some predisposing. There could be a family history of social anxiety there. There could be lots of different things, but generally speaking, we could have that in the predisposing category, right? Now, the third thing would be, what are the precipitating things? Okay. What is precipitating that? Well, let's face it, any potential situation whereby the sense of judgment would be felt or could bring up a sense of being examined and scrutinized. That could be work, home, school, play, wherever it happens to be. So a person could have a multiple multitude of different triggers, you know. And in the spirit then of what this tells us, we move to the next P, which is the perpetuating factors. So basically, everybody, how would you cope if that was happening for you? Well, for better or worse, and often worse, people with a presentation such as social anxiety will develop behavioral patterns and ways of engaging in the world that protect that deep sense of vulnerability in themselves. But in doing the behaviors, keep the fear that something bad is happening socially and that people are judging them. So an example could be, and I used the word earlier, avoidance. You would see quite an amount of avoidance here. Avoidance talking to certain people, avoidance maybe talking to people at all, or a tendency to cancel out situations, not turn up, to over prepare, to ask friends who will be there. All of these things, driven behaviors to cope with that unsettled feeling. Okay. And the list would go on and on. Prinking, for example, pre-drinking, psychological avoidance through using substances. All these things can help people endure the social situation, but are being driven by a discomfort around it. Of a lot of clients I've worked with, they have eventually admitted, particularly the students, that it's yes, it's cheaper to drink at home and go out and have a burnout, but also I'm quite anxious. So the classic social lubricant. Okay? So you see, CBT honors the fact that people aren't stupid. People do the best they can with what they've got. And behavior is generally always congruent to how they feel. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, you will behave in a way to protect yourself from that or to feel a bit better. Just makes sense. Difficulty with it is it prevents you confronting and doing a deeper dive into yourself around what's driving that feeling. What are the thoughts? What are the rules and assumptions? What are the core beliefs that are making this situation feel quite confronting? And then finally, there's the protective aspects. So a person could have a good social network in terms of having people there. They could have some, one-on-one good relationships. Brilliant. They could be part of a gym, part of something that gives them that sense of, even if it's an isolated thing, there's still things we need to embrace and understand in people that they do, to actually do to feel as well as they can and to cope with that. So, okay, so I hope that run through um, has made sense. Again, if you're interested in this, there's plenty of articles online you can read on this. There's plenty of stuff in training you can do on it. But I would just say that it is one of the most essential aspects for practitioners to be aware of when they work with clients is, can they confidently answer and speak to the case they're working with from that formulation perspective? Do they know, have they information in that? If they're missing information, then it's really important they look for that. Okay. And then, of course, the process of any therapeutic intervention is the implementation of the therapy and then the measurement and metricing of improvement as you go. Okay? Remembering that humans are humans. We're all vulnerable. We all have that. Core beliefs, for example, in people tend to stay quite strong. And whilst ideally they might change through a therapeutic process, um, certainly the perspective of most reasonable practitioners is that, you know, we have to manage expectations. And whilst some people can completely turn around, some people will always have vulnerabilities, different things, and that's okay. What matters is that we increase the person's ability to function. Okay? And that becomes so, so important as we go forward. So yeah, so hopefully that's a bit of help. Um, Next video will probably be another story time. A few ideas for that actually. Hmm. Some of them might put me on Rumble though. Like you said something, you know what I'm saying? Okay, everyone. Thanks for listening.